the cons of multiple sites and the cons of the multiple libraries thing. You have to sort of Venn diagram those across each other and decide which ones are the ones that you are the worst for you, and so pick from there, right? And it's a depends kind of scenario. All right, everybody, welcome to Ask and Praxis. It's February 5th, and today we're talking about effective document management strategies for Microsoft 365, the SharePoint edition. The gang is all here, and everybody but Todd has a part, because finally I got my way and blocked it out.
I want to know why I have a stapler.
I
wasn't here
well,
when
you weren't
when
here
you
the
decided.
day we picked icons, so
Yeah.
you get what you get and you don't get upset.
All right.
All right, so we'll start off with the problem statement. And, okay, I'll let that drop. We'll start off with the problem statement, and then we're going to go into the various SharePoint scenarios. So we're going to we're going to take a maturity model approach to this, which we often do. We're going to start with default document library setup. We're going to then talk about adding custom libraries and then multiple sites. And we'll have a little bit about maturity level 500 towards the end of it. So the problem statement I'm stopping.
Before we get to that, quickly.
Yes.
For those who are just joining, we are trying something new to gauge your thoughts on this a little bit. So if you scroll up in the chat a little bit, there is now a poll that we have. So you can let us know when it comes to content management if you're a library person, a customs library person, or a multiple sites person. So just scroll up a little bit, answer for us, so then we can just kind of see where people land.
If you haven't been to an Ask and Praxis before, you won't be able to see that. In the future, we're just sort of figuring that out. We added that new feature, so we'll see how we use it in the future. All right. So our document management problem statement. So some of the things that we hear about document management that sort of led to this conversation, which was actually sort of inspired by some conversations we've been having with some new clients lately. So what are some of the things that we hear? You can't find what you're looking for. That is a super common one, that you can't find what you're looking for. And then in coordination with that is the off-turd search sucks, which I hear all the time. That duplicating of files, and then maybe with different names. And Mark has a great slide in one of his content management talks where he, it's my document _ date _ final JT's version /
Love that
whatever.
slide.
So yeah, it's a great slide with all the different names of all the different.
I stole that, but it's still a great slide.
Well, good to know you're stealing things.
It says it right on the slide. Give her credit.
Oh, all right, good. It can often create a permissions mess. So that's definitely something we hear about a lot. People will start down a road and then get themselves into breaking inheritance for permissions and get themselves into a real pickle with permissions. So that's an often heard issue that people have with document management. And then the one that we do hear quite a bit as well is accidentally reorganizing files, because this happens in file shares, but it also can happen in SharePoint, especially if you're using OneDrive Sync, accidentally dragging a folder into another folder, and then people are like, what happened to our documents, thinking that got deleted, but in reality it was
SharePoint
just
sucks.
moved into big Caleb, yes, big air quotes on accidentally. I think it is more often than not accidental though. Like, people have no idea that they're dragging it, and whoops, there it is, gone, bye-bye. All right, so that's our problem statement. That's what we're going to try to sort of address and talk about. But this is definitely the Choose Your Own Adventures interactive version of Ask and Praxis, and we have quite a few people in the chat. So definitely either enter in chat and or come off mute and talk about your pros and cons to some of these as we go through them. All right, so let's start with Derek. Can you just go a little deeper on the scenarios that we outlined and that we're going to talk about?
Yeah, and so we're starting with the documents library scenario. Essentially, it is the default shared documents document library in any SharePoint site. And essentially, that's really the wild, wild west approach, right? You let people create folders upon folders upon folders. We tend to see this a lot with our clients that have migrated from a file share where they were under the gun for whatever reason to get it, outside of the VPN or whatever. And somebody had a great idea to just sort of go zhunk and drag it all in there. And that has a lot of challenges that folks will sort of go through in a little bit. Sort of the next level that we wanted to talk about was the idea of taking that wild, wild west and breaking it up into custom libraries, specific libraries for specific types of content. Some content is more equal than others. So, what gets prominence, what gets categorized out? And what does that mean from a document and organization perspective? And lastly, this is more of we talked about breaking things up into multiple sites. This is really effective when it comes to lifecycle management for that content, where there may or may not be a site, or there may be a site for a specific unit of work, whether that unit of work is the HR team site, or whether it's a project, or whether it's a group or a meeting, breaking it up into those similar types of content across multiple sites so that you can fully sort of integrate with it and organize your content and provide adequate permissions.
Yeah, perfect. All right, that's a great summary. So now we're going to dive into the sort of maturity level 100. Carrie, you did a great job putting the slide together. Do you want to talk us through sort of the default document library scenario?
Sure. Yeah. And as Derek mentioned, there's more than a few ways to manage stuff in SharePoint, right? And whether it's effective or not kind of depends on your use case, right? So, and what you're trying to accomplish. So this simple scenario, this first one really could work for some things, although we'll kind of see you might hit a wall pretty quickly because it's so basic. So using this sort of out of the box documents library as your only location, like either your main location or your only location, is going to be a problem like pretty soon, right? And just to level set for a minute, the definition for what a document library is just this place to go and put your files, your videos, all of your content for you to either update or reference, or your team to go and access. And so, having this file cabinet ready and available for you out of the box is super convenient, right? It's like, thanks, Microsoft. I have this, lovely out of the box place where I can just start dropping stuff. But what happens is, like I said, you quickly sort of hit a wall where, it's becoming a problem because it's all in one spot. And so using this sort of approach sort of aligns with what we call like that level 100 maturity model, which is essentially, less organized types of content. It has that limited file structure. You might have less formality around your naming conventions or your permissions or just your hierarchy of your content in general. So, I kind of take it like that this is sort of aligning with that lower maturity level by just using this simple out of the box container that they give you. So, while it comes, pre-configured with some different columns you can use and in a simple view, like I said, you do sort of hit that wall right away just because it isn't optimized for organizing your content. And so the pros here are, like I said, it's easy to use, it's convenient, it's ready to go. It has some basic stuff built in, which is great. And it is a central place. So, for those of us who are like, oh, all my team will be able to find everything because it's in this one spot, it sort of meets that need, right? We don't have to think too much. It's all going to be right here. Also, you can use some of those things we love about libraries, like the folders and the metadata and such, if you choose to, and you can track versioning. So it has all the bells and whistles that we like, but it's super basic. And, the cons of this, like I said, is because it's in that single spot, eventually it's going to be hard to find your content. And, having the ability to add those folders sounds great, but as Derek mentioned, this could quickly become the Wild West where you're nesting folder into folder, and then you start to have other problems. So long URLs, duplicate files, some documents might align to more than one folder, and now you put them in two places. So It's definitely a con using this one library for that. And then also security, right? So it's not going to support anything more complicated than just a few people that have the same access to the same files. So, at some point, you really don't want to mix content in the same place where you have those varying permissions. And then the last thing here is retention, which, there's tons of ways that you can sort of support retention policies and stuff, but mixing content that has different retention periods in the same place isn't really going to be your best option. So just some simple pros and cons. But again, if it's a simple use case, I get it. But most situations are not going to be that. And very quickly, you're going to need to do some other things that I think Patrick is going to be able to explain in a minute.
Yeah, and I think it's part of recognizing when you've outgrown it before you've outgrown it so much that you're in a bind, right? And that's that can be really tricky. The security one, I just wanted to touch on that, it can support some complex permissions, but that may be a management nightmare, right? And so it is not only a con in that you can't do it sometimes, but you don't want to do it sometimes, and it can create, more problems than it's worth. So absolutely worth mentioning that. Great job, Carrie, for covering that first one. All right, Patrick, you're up. I didn't move your cheese around today, so you'll be very happy with me. Let's talk about custom libraries. And when we had the poll earlier, there was some question and confusion about what we meant by custom libraries, so you might want to address that too. But maturity model 200, where are we now?
So custom libraries, what we mean by that is you have to hire a designer to come in and start playing around with it. No, just kidding.
Bookcase with the rolling shelf. I love those.
Yeah,
I want one. The ladder. Yeah.
Wallpaper on the ceiling. Sorry.
Yeah.
Tangent. So ideally, when we think about documents in libraries, we think of document libraries having a specific purpose at the top level, and each document having metadata attached to it, and not necessarily in a folder, which is kind of what our best practice scenario would be. So what we mean by custom is instead of having that one library that Carrie was just talking about, the one library Carrie was just talking about, you kind of do a pre-sort and give some IA around the documents that you have. So maybe you have a bunch of documents that are policies. Well, why not create a policy library where you can assign a policy content type to it? And then within there, you can attach the metadata to the different types of policies, whether that's department-based, maybe it's an HR policy or a finance policy, or it only applies to a specific department. It's not like a corporate policy. There's different types of metadata you can attach to it. So it's a little bit more than just one place to put your documents. You can do a little bit more advanced metadata management to it, which of course helps with better searchability. So you can, using the metadata and things like that, you can do a PNP search. You can sort that data in a different way. You can sort by the type of content type, as well as the metadata. And your columns can be made a little bit more specific. So if the content type is used across multiple sites, you can then build that content type at a higher level, put in all the columns and the metadata that you want attached with that, whether you have term sets and stuff, and you can use that on both your HR site and your finance site. It makes it much easier in the long run just to create the library and then apply the content type that way.
Absolutely. And you sort of get that whole, like, you're getting a starting of information architecture just by breaking things out into different libraries. And then as you're sort of, as you were mentioning, sort of adding those content types to it to get a more bespoke amount of metadata that you can then do more with, and it becomes even more powerful. But that starting point of at least just having a library for each of the sort of content types that you want, and then maybe giving it an actual content type underneath that is much more powerful.
Correct. You still have your... Oh, go ahead, Caleb.
As I say, it also opens up the doors to being able to do things when you're doing large transformations of documents for a department or something, where you can point ShareGate at a particular library and say, I want to do bulk editing of the content. So if you've applied that content type and they haven't assigned stuff, it's amazing how much easier it is for your customers when you hand them an Excel spreadsheet with their file names and say, identify your metadata here in the columns, then here's your library, go touch each one and update them in SharePoint.
Sure.
Yeah, because you're not mixing content types. That's an excellent point, Caleb. Absolutely excellent point.
I think this approach also gives you room to grow, right? And so where we were talking about the single document library, you will eventually, scale out of that. This scenario gives you a space where you can start small and just chunk it up into different libraries, and then grow and add in and layer in additional metadata and grow your maturity.
And this is really just such an easy next step up, right? Just from what you already have, you're essentially getting all the same kind of things. It's just, you've already taken that first stab at that type of content being separated. And so it definitely helps for all those reasons.
And when you want to even move up further, you've already sort of broken things out. And so it makes it easier to then break it out even further. And Mark's going to talk about that in a few minutes. Patrick, did you have more you wanted to share on this slide?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, certainly you hit some of the same things that Carrie mentioned in terms of versioning control. You do have better permissions and security, so you could have like your HR policies are open to everyone, but maybe there's something specific just for managers. You can more easily permission by folder as opposed to by document. Again, I also have that, if you note, under a con, because obviously we want to permission at the highest level possible. Try to stay away from a per document permissioning because it just becomes a mess. But you can certainly assign better security and permissions, as well as sensitivity labels and retention in an easier way using a custom library.
Yep, absolutely. Because that bigger container, again, we can say, okay, everything in this container as a library can have a certain set of permissions on it. Instead of saying, oh, well, we have this one library, like Carrie was mentioning, one library with folder, and now we're trying to break permissions at the folder level for that library, where if we take those top level folders and we say, oh, there's a document library for each one of these folders, now that folder gets a certain set of permissions, and so you're breaking it at the library level instead of the folder level, and then even going further down into that breaking of permissions, which, as we have been talking about and as is going on in the chat, breaking permissions inside of a document library at the folder level or the item level quickly becomes problematic. I mean, if you need it, but maybe it's better to rethink it and say, hey, if I'm breaking item level permissions at the folder or item level, why am I doing that? And is this content really belongs somewhere else? And should I be bringing it together in a holistic view using some other different method than trying to jam it all in one security boundary and change the permissions on it? All right, so let's move forward then to multiple sites. And so Patrick started touching on this a little bit during his discussion of content types and being able to bring those up a level and apply them across sites. Mark, let's dig into this 400 level maturity of multiple sites. So we sort of skipped 300, but I think there's sort of like a vibe of move between having multiple document libraries and having multiple sites. So there's sort of a hybrid that you could work in there. That's sort of the 300.
Yeah, I don't know if this is 400 or 300, but it's moving in the right direction. It's becoming more mature. So in reality, this is all additive. So you still have the documents library, and if it's a team site, well, actually, if it's any site, you can have additional libraries. But then we're thinking now about multiple sites. So when we try to jam all of our activity into one site, we end up with some of the problems that the others have talked about. So if you think about sort of right-sizing everything that you do into containers, and we use the word containers a lot because it can mean site, library, folder, containers that allow you to treat content differently based on what your process is, what your culture is, what your work product is. So multiple sites are, we usually think about building them for different units of work. And that's in quotes and a little vague on purpose, because a unit of work might be all of the people in the HR department working on HR stuff together, or a project that HR is doing in order to pick a new benefit. Those are different units of work. And if you separate units of work out into separate sites, then you have some immediate benefits. How you provision those can be, something that you do manually, or you can use a great tool like ShareGate or Orchestry to provision them in a more organized way. So there are ways to make this work really well. So some of the pros of having multiple sites for different units of work are you have better lifecycle management. So let's take that HR example where we're just trying to work together to come up with a new specific benefit. Well, that's a project that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And when something ends, then you can start a clock ticking for, how long do we need to keep this? How long do we need to manage this? How long do we care about who the owners of the site were? When you have a folder within another site or within a giant library, it's very hard to do that lifecycle management stuff. So that lifecycle management improvements using multiple sites are pretty big. The permissions, when you have a site that is for a unit of work, you manage the permissions at the site level. So it's basically like, if you can get into this room, you have the right to touch anything in it. And that's just a much, much simpler permissions approach than trying to figure out, well, who should have access to this one specific subfolder that contains this particular set of stuff. If you can get in, you can access everything. And another great thing about having a different site for different units of work is that you can invite external users into a site like this HR thing where we're working on a new benefit, and we want our outside vendor to be able to come in and work with us on some of the documents. You can invite those external users in and be sure that all they have access to, and whether it's by intentional or unintentional, all they're going to have access to is the stuff that's in that particular site that you've given them permission to. Now, all of these things can be managed in a single document library or in multiple document libraries, but it's just so much easier if you had a site per unit of work. So what are the cons of this? Well, IT people will always say, but then we'll have site sprawl. We'll have so many sites. And my answer to that is, well, if you have a lot of sites that are helping people get their work done, that's a good number of sites. There's no particular number of sites you ought to have in a tenant. It's the right number for the work that you do. So site sprawl is considered a con from a management perspective or a sort of technology perspective, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. But I listed it under the cons. You do have to think about, well, what is, and have an understanding of, and also a willingness to put in some work to manage those life cycles, to think about what retention should be. You can automate a lot of this stuff. Retention works best on a site level, though you can certainly have retention set on, things 12 layers deep in folders. You'll never be able to manage it. If you really think about the unit of work and how long that needs to stick around, that's a good level if you're just dipping your toe into the retention kind of concept. How long should we keep this thing? If you need it at a content type level, then that's another level of complexity, which we aren't really getting into here. And then another con is if you want to sync content down to your local machine from many, many different sites, you have to decide to do that. And you'll have essentially what looks like a different folder on your machine, whether, regardless of which platform you're on, a sort of a folder per site, per library per site, depending on how you set up your sync points. So that can be a little bit overwhelming, but it also gives you a lot more flexibility. but there's a downside in that you need to think about what you want to sync a little bit more. The upside to that is that you have more flexibility. So like I said,
we have go ahead, Mark.
Sorry, go ahead. No,
I was just going to say we have a chat question or comment, and I think we should try to address it if we can. So Dan was saying, he was sort of like nervously saying, what about a single site, like a department level site, where every project gets its own document library? And I think what that is what I was talking about before, that sort of hybrid approach. It's sort of in between. Yep. I love the fact that you're creating a container for every project. That's absolutely going to help you avoid some of the cons of having folders inside of those document libraries, which make it much harder to manage from a lifecycle perspective. It also makes it harder to manage from a permissions perspective. If you're making a project library and everyone that has access to the site has access to one or more of those libraries, and you're thinking about breaking permissions at the library level, I'm not mad about that. I think it's something that you can, if you as a site owner, manage if you want to. It's probably not overwhelming until you get to a point where you don't have a life cycle, a governance plan in this case, because there's not a lot of tools that can manage at the document level for life cycle management. You'd have to do something bespoke if you wanted to. It absolutely could be done bespoke, but you'd have to do it. So I think there's this sort of idea that you would have to call them out. When a project is done, what are you going to do with that document library? Can we move it to a different site, like an archive site? What can we do with it? Whereas if you considered multiple sites, now having an archive policy around that site is something Microsoft is actually already supporting for you and sort of helps you out. So there's this, the cons of multiple sites and the cons of the multiple libraries thing. You have to sort of Venn diagram those across each other and decide which ones are the ones that you are the worst for you, and so pick from there, right? And it's a depends kind of scenario. So because we're running out of time, let me poke forward here. I came up with a few sort of 500 level extensibility ideas that maybe can just help think things through, things that I've done or things that I've been thinking about. So the extensibility answer can sort of help overcome some of the out-of-box limitations we've been talking to up till now. So with the multiple site scenario, this is one that I come across often, where we'll have project-based sites and every project has a particular library. Let's say it's for, let's say every project is for a project that has invoices associated with it, right? Like every project will have billables coming in from vendors, and you want to store those invoices in the project, but accounting doesn't want to sync to 200, 500, 800 document libraries, but you have a central project list. What if you create a drop library for all the accounting vendor invoices or whatever, and you have accounting just put them in there and tag them with the project they go to, and then you have some custom code that goes through and goes, oh, this goes there, this goes this goes there, and it manages that for you. So those are ways that you can sort of reduce the friction of what that out-of-the-box structure gives you to sort of take away some of the cons from one or the other to get yourself to where you need to be. PnP Modern Search, great one for the opposite situation. If you've got hundreds of projects and you're like, hey, but I want to see all of the invoices from all of my projects all in one place and be able to filter and sort them by project name and by who the vendor was and whatever it might be, Search Solutions bringing that content together is a really great answer. And all of this leans on the fact that we have content types for these things. Again, Copilot and SharePoint agent solutions. Now, this is something that's sort of out of the box, especially with the SharePoint agents, but being able to set up an agent in a document library to sort of help us figure out use artificial intelligence to sort of bring the content of that document library together is something you can do. And then Mark was talking about site lifecycle management. Obviously, we talked about it. You could build your own solutions custom. So with Dan's scenario where he has one site with a bunch of document libraries per project, you could build custom bespoke solution that would basically have a list that said, oh, this is the project library for this project. tracking some sort of status against it that could then move that content to a different place or delete it altogether or consolidate it in some way. You could absolutely make some your own custom solution for that scenario. But then there's third-party solutions. We mentioned ShareGate and Orchestrate already that handle and help you set up that provisioning, archive, guest management, governance lifecycle that goes with having multiple sites. Not that multiple sites is always the right solution, but it often can be. All right, we are at 1 o'clock, so let me move on. Some resources you can click on if you want to. We are going to take it this same topic and hit it from a Teams perspective in the next episode. So February 19th, join us again live. Love to have you here. The chat is going crazy, but I can't read it all and talk at the same time, so I can't really address all of that. But we're going to talk about Teams specifically, or point this at the Teams sort of through a Teams lens the next time we talk about it. Join us live. Mark and I will be in Miami. We're leaving tomorrow, so we'll be there. If you're there, we'd love to see you. Say hello to us. Mark, Derek, and I are going to be at the Microsoft 365 Community Conference in Vegas. We do have a now $150 discount for that code. Use some Praxis 150 if you'd like to join us in Vegas. Julie, the same people, will be at European Collaboration Summit in Germany end of May. And then Derek and I will be at TechCon 365 in Seattle in June. So definitely join us for all those. We'll end up with a discount code for TechCon Seattle, so wait for that. We'll get it out to you as soon as we can. So that's what we had. Thanks, everybody. We'll answer questions in the chat after this session is over. Thanks, everyone, and take care, and see you next time. Thank you so much for joining us this week on Ask Some Praxis. We love getting your questions or session ideas. You can submit by using the link in About. If you find this helpful, hit that like or subscribe button and share this content with your colleagues.